Hello again. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about interpreting kata bunkai and technique sequences. It's important for me to share this with you so that you have some idea of how my whole project has progressed. So first let me point out that one kata can represent an entire fighting system. That's my own take on it, but that has to be put in the context of old Okinawa. Let me expand on that. So the children, the bushi, their children, so bushi means warrior class, grew up cutting their teeth on a martial art known as tegumi. It's a wrestling art. And they were doing this in their childhood, and this wrestling is a really rough and tumble bout that includes wrestling and then submissions like joint locks and chokes. So this was going on as children. As a matter of fact, one of my teachers, Seiyu Oyada, his father was a champion. So Gichin Funakoshi also details this in his book, Karate Do, My Way of Life. Other things that we can consider is that in the modern era, when tegumi was still available, but we found that if you do some research, a lot of karateka also studied judo or jiu-jitsu. For example, Chojun Miyagi had a 6th dan in judo. The grappling component, therefore, is really taken care of in this overall context of Okinawa. So it doesn't need to be represented within the kata. I also feel that kickboxing was well known in Okinawa, and that it was also something that the Bushi warrior class was playing with, including their children. If you look at kickboxing throughout the entire world, it's essentially the same. What do I mean by that? When you look at karate, sabat, Muay Thai, etc., the overall concepts, I would agree that the details are different, but the overall concepts are the same. So I think that kata does not need to represent a lot of that because it's well-known knowledge. There are parts in there, obviously, but it doesn't need as much representation because it's considered to be, well-known knowledge at that time. So it's something that has spread throughout, and if you take a look and read some of the old stories of Okinawa, there would be different sailors that would come in from other ports and other areas, and there would be contests and bouts. And so obviously that whole idea of kickboxing that's described in those bouts was well spread throughout the whole world. So if we really think about this, what is kata representing if it's not representing grappling and it's not showing much of the kickboxing skills? So we really need to answer that question. What does kata represent? Answering this question is really key to understanding bunkai. If we were to look at the whole situation, kata is that close range fighting part of the system that connects the kickboxing to the grappling. So it is that bridge that's in between. Now, that close range fighting can be used strictly unto itself without a need for the kickboxing or the grappling for tegumi, or it might be mixed with either one of them. When you take that as an overall context, you could say then that one kata represents a fighting system, and that if we look into it with the kickboxing and tegumi, it represents a complete mixed martial arts fighting solution. Here are some additional thoughts that I think will help you with seeing how I interpreted bunkai, all right, and discovered this different information that was in the kata. Now I'm gonna pull from my book, so I'm actually gonna be looking down a little bit, so I apologize for that. One of the things we want to know is that, for example, when the kata shows an arm drag, that means that all arm drags are now on the table. So anytime a kata shows a technique, that concept from the technique can be utilized in other ways. We want to remember that this is all about fighting. So all of the elements of fighting need to be included whenever we look at an overall solution. So that means we know we're going to run into resistance. We're going to need to use things like distraction. We might need to throw a headbutt in there. We might need a low line kick or a knee. Some of those elements are in the kata. For example, the cross step can be a knee bump. Of course, you've got that low strike, which you can sneak in order to distract somebody when you're trying to work something on top. All those kinds of elements are very important to providing an overall solution. So we keep that in mind. We're going to be using locks from the clinch. When there is a lock, something that I want you to keep in mind is we're using it to break their posture, all right, to take that balance. So we're using that to move them, we're using that to throw them, we're using it for a purpose like that, but the idea is not to submit them in a standing position. Oftentimes when you're working this, especially when you get a partner that becomes more and more knowledgeable to the clinch, so as you're practicing this, you're going to find that they're going to start breaking away from your clinch. So we're going to continue to apply forward pressure, usually through strikes or swimming in. We'll learn about pummeling that allow you to come in and reestablish that clinch. So in another video, we'll go on more into why the clinch is so important. We've talked about it in previous videos. But we're going to have one that's dedicated to the clinch so you understand why there's so much discussion about the clinch. There are traps in the Hanji Shodan kata as well as other katas that we're going to study. Hanji Shodan is our foundation kata, and when we look there, there's not only basic traps, but there's complex trapping. What I want you to keep in mind is that we're going to use the trap as a way to get in and establish a clinch to start breaking posture and balance. So the trap can be part of that process. When you're in trapping range, you're still in striking range. That means whether it's somebody who's well trained in MMA or somebody who's just flailing, you're in a position where you could catch a strike, be knocked out. So I try not to stay in trapping lanes for very long. I'm closing that gap, and that's one of the reasons why I don't use complex traps the majority of the techniques that we put together in terms of sequences. Matter of fact, I pretty much avoid them because I feel like it leaves you in a position of danger. We know that there is that chambering hand that is so prevalent in karate, and it is interpreted correctly that it's often grabbing somebody's wrist and pulling that wrist in as you're striking them. I don't use that interpretation for a very important reason. When you pull somebody in by the wrist, you've left a lot of, there's actually a large gap in there, and you really haven't controlled their ability to move very much. So if you do strike them, and let's say they block it or they can just absorb the blow, you have not controlled that body that's in front of you. You haven't broken their posture usually by pulling in. So it leaves you in a very vulnerable position, especially for a large opponent to open up the distance and start, dropping bombs on you. So you won't see me using that matter of fact, I can't think of any at all that I really use in the Hanji Shodan interpretations. The clinch is very important because it takes you out of the power range of your opponent and puts you in a place where you can use some of your most powerful blows. All right. For example, the elbow strike from the Hanji. We've got knee strikes. Those are both incredibly devastating strikes to use. We want to think about the fact that we want to be where we can be protected and provide the most damage. The other thing that you want to consider about the clinch is that it's the gateway to the ground. If you understand the clinch, you can do a lot to prevent yourself from being taken down if you don't want to go to the ground, and also, or control the way you do go to the ground. And when you combine that with the ability to sprawl, you have a really great defense to takedowns and throws. Lastly, what I'll throw in about the clinch is that it's one of the least understood of the fighting ranges, not only in MMA. You do see it and they understand it better, but if you do some research on the internet, you're going to see that on the street that they understand kickboxing, they understand ground grappling, but in between is an absolute mess. They really don't understand that clinch range, so we can take advantage of it. So lastly, to guide us in creating technique sequences, I use the 3 goals of combat taught to me by Sagun Paul Vunak. He taught the same things to SEAL Team 6. Those 3 goals are the entry, pressure, and termination. Now I use finish in terms of termination because I'm dealing mainly with a civilian situation. So let's look at each one of those individually and how they play into the overall idea of doing a technique sequence of bunkai. So entry. The whole idea of the entry is to get the opponent to start reacting to you. For example, in the Hanji Shodan, we have the inverted punch. That inverted punch could be used in a sparring situation where you're squared off with each other, or it could be in a conversational face-to-face situation. That can be used to start that entry and get him in reaction to you. And the great thing about that is it actually starts us into our next goal, which is pressure. So if you do the entry right, you've already started the pressure phase. So pressure, the idea of pressure is that we want to disrupt posture in that goal. When we do that, we take away the posture, we take away balance. With no balance, that means you're very weak, you don't have a lot of strength that you can apply, and it also reduces mobility. Doing those things is going to make it much harder for our opponent to hurt us and allow us to set him up for the finish. Now, the finish would be, if we go back for just a sec before I get too far into the finish here, when we're talking about the pressure phase, we're normally pushing our way in either through strikes or through pummeling, which will teach that process to you in order to gain a clinch. And in that clinch, we're going to use strikes and off balancing to break that posture and have control of the balance. Now, that all sets up the termination, or what I like to call the finish phase. All right, so when we're finishing, this is going to be taking the opponent to the ground. In other videos, I've talked about the fact that the idea is the result of putting together a technique sequence of bunkai should result in the opponent being knocked out or taken to the ground, where they can be either given a disabling set of blows or submitted. I go with the latter. The reason why is because it's not always easy to set up a knockout. It's much easier to get in, get the clinch, and set them up for a throw so that you can follow up with those disabling blows or the submission. So that's what I'm looking for in that finish phase. We also want to add the fact that once we do that, we want to assess the situation between us and the opponent and also our surroundings so we know what's going on there as well. The foundation kata for this is Hanji Shodan, and Hanji Shodan has all the elements that we need in order to meet each of the three of these goals. So by doing that, by meeting those goals with the different bunkai that's available, we set up a sequence that becomes an overall solution for a situation that you might find yourself in. It becomes that complete solution to an MMA type style attack that we might experience on the street. I hope the insights that I've given you here will help you understand how I'm researching and pulling bunkai out so that you might be able to do the same for yourself in the future. It also gets into how we're utilizing it with technique sequences, and we do this with the Hanji Shodan, but it is available and we do it with all the rest of the katas that we look at as well. So again, I'm excited to have you with me on this adventure as we move through this journey, and I look forward to working with you more. Please help us continue to bring you some great videos by subscribing to our channel and sharing our videos.